Guten Abend, herzlich willkommen. Good evening, warm welcome to our last evening lecture in this semester. You know that the main umbrella is called activism, and it's my great pleasure and honor to welcome Nemanja Zimonjić tonight. Nemanja, or Nemi, has studied in Belgrade, where he has completed a bachelor and a master program, as well in Zurich at the ETH, where he completed his studies with a master in 2013. Then I think you basically immediately started as an assistant with Tom Emerson for a few years, more precise till from 2013 to 2021, and co-founded the group 10 with another 7 colleagues in 2016. 10 is something that you will explain, I think, more in detail. 10 is a group of people connected through architecture and research. 10 is a way of working. I think 10 is also a culture of working that is probably much closer to the younger generation than to my generation, where we would do duos, and we would be this duo, if possible, for a lifetime. And from the explanations I understood that 10 is a group that grows and can shrink again, that can bring together people closer and also further away. I think 10 is a contemporary culture of working, a contemporary culture of producing architecture. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing more about the way you're working. And I know you probably also know that 10 in the last month or years has been rather successful, winning bigger competitions, and is starting also to step into the production of architecture. So again, Nemi, we're really happy that you're here. Welcome, and we're looking forward to your lecture.
Thank you very much, Johannes. Thank you, everyone, for the invitation. Thank you for having us. And I say us because I'm really just one of the voices in the group, and that is something that is sort of very, very important to us, that we can always be represented by a single voice or multiple voices. It's a pleasure to speak here at the school. It's my first time at the school. I've gotten a walkthrough tour, and I've been sort of impressed what I've seen. At the same time, felt very comfortable. So I look forward to show you a little bit of our culture. So thank you for sharing your culture that you've established, and I look forward to show a little bit of our culture tonight. The topic of activism is, let's say, very close to us, although we don't really consider ourselves activists, maybe only by means of architecture or design, so it comes very natural to speak about it through design. But it is about establishing and growing and maintaining. After all, it's all about that long process of maintenance, a culture of dialogue, of debate, of questioning, of fragilities, of failure, so it's sort of not being afraid to step into the unknown. And in a way, it is kind of a search for an environment. And this is a drawing that we always fall back to. We call it the functional equation of 10. And it is a way to describe how we work and how we sort of encounter projects, but both the people that shape those projects. So tonight I will show you some of the projects. There's a lot of slides, but I will show you some 5 projects, you could say. And before that, I'll show you a little bit more about the 10 project, or what we actually do. Because I realized in the past year or two there's been a lot of questions to us that were also related to the way we work, that is still very much in this kind of search, but it's already interesting to start putting somehow geometries to that as a designer. So we are currently a group of 17 people, so it is a very dynamic number. It always changes. It's not symbolic at all. There is various backgrounds and various expertises and various interests. There's various gravitational points in 10. There are mostly architects, if not all, fabricators and makers, would say borderline writers. There's AI students. There's a kind of group that is constantly shaping, and it's very dynamic. So it's also slightly hard to show it just through names, but also maybe through interests, because we are not really experts outside of anything. I wouldn't say architecture that we are experts, but we are the most interested in architectural production. And the rest is basically the interests that we grow. What really defines us, I would say it started to anchor us very well, is the group of people we really work closely with. So in a way that we have established a culture of working, I'll show you that in a bit, in which others can join and actually form kind of various constellations where these interests then could actually attach themselves or overlap. And that produces the body of work that is really live and that really, I wouldn't say self-referential, but it really is important to us to kind of consider it daily from all possible aspects. In a way, one of the possible ways of working in 10 is this one, and it's a kind of structure by involvement. There's clear project leads, there's clear responsibilities, there's moderators of projects, there's leads of projects. What is interesting is that members in 10 can actually choose which one of these roles they want to pick. So in a way, it's a culture of getting involved, unlike the culture of, we call it laying blame. And we try to avoid that type of structure as much as we can. The networks that we established is actually, or we are establishing, is showing that resilience. And I think the best thing about the network is that, and you can consider us a collaborative practice, is that once it grows very stable, and it's actually very hard to kind of damage, and in a way also the kind of failures and cracks become a part of it. And in 10 there's several entities, there's multiple entities, it's not a firm. You can consider just 10 as kind of a label under which there is something called the Institute, which is and it has always been the research platform. It was actually the source of 10, and legally it's an association. There is the 10 Studio, which is the very speculative one, which is very dynamic, and perhaps the daily one still has been for years the most dominant one in 10, where even execution has happened, where individual trajectories have happened. And that led to a new kind of ring that we call 10 Works, which is going to now have a kind of also legal status, but a framework for execution. And it's important to say this is not fixed. So regardless of this kind of entities and legal formats, there's also individuals that can actually float between these. There is a kind of constant need of maintenance, but not out of malfunction. Pressing issues, daily issues in 10 are communicated through a form I will show you. But let's say, since we are an association, we were guided by a statute. So in a way, that was the first act. And since then, that statute has been updated. But one could say there was a transition in which it didn't have to become formal anymore. It had just become very, very organic. So the set of questions and the set of sort of rules are constantly there. And as you can see, some of them deal with, it's an open door policy. There is no limit to how big it can be. It is one's own, so it's actually a shared ownership through all entities. There's a voting system. And for example, there is always a question of how do you define a strength of a vote, because it's also not just a pure democracy in that sense. There is something we've established a year ago, which is a structure of tiers. And that is interesting because it's not in a kind of classical way to do with founding partners or let's say the experience within the structure. It's more to do with the dynamic, with the interest, and also with the a need, because you could go up or you could jump down in tiers. It doesn't matter. It's a kind of individual choice. We've recently come to a conclusion that we all have to continue as well our education. So that is something that is now a kind of a constant dialogue. And then there's this a need to accept failure and success equally. So although we are, maybe you said, contemporary practice, we like to be in a room. We like to be in a big drafting room all together. I don't think we look all in the same direction, but there is a kind of a physical space, and at the moment 10 is mostly situated between Zurich in Switzerland and Belgrade in Serbia, with some of the people also floating around UK, Finland, and across Europe, mostly. Recently even Australia. So that kind of culture is then overlaid with something that we've established, I think, in the 10 studio several years ago. And this is a screenshot from the Valve manual. I don't know if you're familiar with that company. It's quite the kind of interesting company in gaming that has a very radical and very fresh way of, not anymore, but it's still fresh way of setting up an organization. And we have a culture of a plug-in desk. So at any point in any project, any member could join. So those desks that you've seen before are actually quite movable. Of course, that is something that is regulated by several factors in 10, but never by a kind of hierarchical structure. And we've crossed into a space of, let's say, digital communication such as Discord that has allowed us full transparency. So you will see finance, you will see design, you will see arguments, you will see voting system. It is something that basically falls down or falls back to one's own responsibility, or how active you are on the Discord. That's how active you get to be later as well in the design. So it's not really, it's beyond the chat program. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it allowed us actually to structure quite a lot of things. And I'll reveal this just for clarity. For example, on the left side, you can see in terms of governance, we have quite a lot of channels, but this is just a screenshot of one of the motions that was voted on. So it's a very simple rule, how you choose what is of interest of the group and what not. And in that way, the democracy is still very active, and it's very applicable. On the other hand, once we get the question, let's say this is a question for a pre-qualified competition that we recently got. After studying the brief, after asking a few questions, we've brought it to the Discord, and actually people were able to vote for or no, or actually take the project by themselves. And you can see actually what happened. The result was that we had to say thank you for various reasons, but this is also something that is very, very much transparent and very much governed by always the current dynamics. I would say we always looked at ourselves as our favorite metaphor was always the record label, because we understood 10 as a record label for architecture, in which, yes, you can be a duet, but you can also be a solo artist, or you can just have an orchestra. And of course, there's different kinds of complexities to an orchestra than to have a solo career. But it's very much possible that within 10, you could simply forever do your own projects. of course, the nature of the group is such that you're involved very quickly into the dialogue with the others. So in many ways, as sort of record label, if we can somehow look at it as designers, I would say there's maybe two topics I would like to show tonight, or sort of have together with the kind of notion of activism, and that is how we acted as young architects, or still very kind of young practice, only a couple of years old, in sense of sufficiency, or what is there, or how we kind of found work, because there was no big relatives or families or direct commissions to start with. It took actually several years of building that up. And one of it is sort of the you could say, aesthetic of necessary that we're always occupied with, and the other is the inappropriate technology. And of course, we all know beyond 10 what is at stake today. What is the actual team that we all have to deal with? So that has shaped completely the conversations within the space. But on the other hand, we always ask ourselves as architects, how can we act? How can we, what kind of a design can we provide for that question? And that's actually where a few projects that I'll later show will explain that. I mean, this is the image of the blue marble. It's probably the most reproduced image in history. But at the same time, it is quite a low-tech, like a very simple image in a way that has been misused and used in various ways, but it still caused a major activist environmental movements when it was done in 1972. And of course, you all know powers of 10 that actually have nothing to do with us, but what is fascinating about this is that with very simple means, they were able to kind of go from the atomic to the grand scale, and perhaps that is still somehow in the nature of how we operate as a group, or what kind of a design interests us, but also how we get to that, because in a way it's always a question of how much is enough for an idea. So we, as humans, are inherently technological animals. There is a kind of bidirectional relationship with technology. But at the same time, after reaching certain technologies, at the very end we're quite simple as to what we want to achieve. And more technology doesn't mean more, it means maybe more choice, but it doesn't mean more success. So this is as well an exercise we've done with the AI called Machine in the Garden. We started playing with it in 2019 without really knowing what it was or how to deal with it. And we still don't know how to really deal with it, but it was quite useful. And today, of course, you can see there are movements as well against it. And we all know that it kind of snuck into our everyday practice. At the same time, we've used it even if we used it badly. And I think that's been sort of encouraging through the process of establishing a working culture and the dialogue, that there are no forbidden questions and forbidden grounds, because at the end of the day, this was a quick project that we've done back then. We were asked by Carnet's Italian magazine to draw the room of 10 as a space we work in. And we've actually drawn it in the left corner, and in the right corner we've drawn the one we would like to be working in. And everything in between is iteration. Is a very almost a primitive way of making that gradient. But what was interesting, that we already back then considered all of them quite buildable. So today we know that the technology it fits in a pocket, but at the same time, a few decades ago, it was the size of a room. It was almost architecture. And today it's everyday tools, and we often forget actually how complex these tools have become, or sometimes I feel that we also add layers that continue adding layers of complexity that are also not necessary. So what we are frankly interested in is sort of the quest on how to undesign that. And here you see Harvard Mark II, basically the first kind of largest computer at that time that was broken down by a moth, so-called a bug that flew in. And in that sense, that kind of relationship still interests us. But at the bottom line, we're designers. And I think we would always search in every design that sufficiency or that necessity or that necessary idea, that lineament in a classical way, that would allow us to really stick to it and to kind of hold a basic robust idea survive whatever conditions are thrown at it. In the end, as architects, and I think this is still something we can fall back to since probably a couple of 100 years, is a drawing. Is a kind of our technology, it's our primitive technology, and this is actually the most primitive technology, but it's still very useful to tell a story and actually to execute the project. So constantly there is a question on how far do I need to draw, what I draw, can I build what I don't draw, and do I need to stop at a certain point to be able to build? So this sentence is quite dear to us, and it sort of explains that bidirectional nature, that we are essentially technological and primordial simultaneously. And this is a quote by Michael Heiser, that actually the idea is to kind of make art that reflects that premise. So we often ask ourselves, what is, or how much do you need to achieve something? From what do you start with? And how do you actually work with it? So I'll show you a first project. It was a project we've done in 2016. Call it the 6 failures in the case of earthquakes. And it was a project very far away. It was in Nepal, Tame Valley. And what is important to say, it started for us with the kind of earthquake that took away almost 80% of the built environment, man-made built environment in Nepal at that year. And what as well became kind of a pressing issue was to find models and ways and prototypes on how to react. The Sherpa community in Tame Valley invited us to not design, but to kind of think on how can we develop a model that would not only serve religious buildings and housing buildings, but also public communal buildings. And there was 2 major obstacles to building for us that we never faced. One was basically building on lake beds, also glacial lake beds, and the other one was the kind of the programmatic, let's say, unclarity that at that time for us was not ready. So we had to kind of walk in and develop a culture of doing something that we did not know how it's going to be applied. In this environment, which is actually extremely hostile, in which you have to build, or let's say traditionally they build in one way, and that is to carry these logs for about 3 days on their backs until they reach the construction site. So really brutal, really difficult. We've tried to avoid that completely. We've tried to take that out of the construction site and try to kind of introduce a novel way of approaching construction by using only things at the site or local resource. We've started with a series of local workshops to give it a public meaning, as well a model, in which actually you can see here a rolling table in which we've discussed possible ways to design a structure. And through those workshops, there was a vote that the first building would be the monks' residence that was destroyed in the earthquake. It was several hundred years old before that. Looking with the engineering department from ETH, we've sort of established several principles for earthquake failures at these very, very simple buildings. And I won't go into them in depth, but you will see them applied. So this was the site where the old monks' residence used to be, and all we had was just that site and sort of the valley. And here you can see how essentially the weight of the building, or everything that building was made of, did not come from the valleys down or had to be brought up, but actually we've just carved it from the mountain directly, very, very close to the site. Very simple floor plan that we've drawn on the site that allowed a growth in structural growth in the proportion of 3, 2, and 1, because we also wanted to allow certain flexibility for the space, and that was actually our office space on the site. So the construction site was very simple. I'll show a few slides where the stone that was on the site was reused for the foundations. But you can see here actually how the whole process of making and working with the material on site was being played out. And this was something that we were completely new to. We were foreigners. There was one of us for 2.5 months there, and he had to actually encounter things that he'd never seen before, and also climates he never seen before. So in a way, we've become part of the group on site, and there was several local methods that we kind of tried to integrate into the site, but also a few that we've tried to avoid, such as well this one. It is actually quite a hostile environment for these young men who have to carry kind of these rocks constantly. So, and there is no health insurance that would cover this. But it's the only way that they can build, and it's the only economy that they know. What we've done with the building was essentially design the structural system that allowed it to work against the earthquake. That was a kind of combination of masonry, light timber elements, and you could say weaving or wire. So traditional techniques were present on site and quite essential. But as well, this small, let's say, twist or tweak, this kind of invention of introducing a new material that was very easy to bring up, so you didn't have to import it, that actually kind of binds the whole building together, was, let's say, the one thing that where we found ourselves most active and most useful. And that drawing is essentially the design, but it's also a hidden design. You won't ever see it because on top of that came a level of a layer of plaster, but it was actually kind of a mud mortar plaster that we've as well tweaked by 5% by adding lime from the local river in order to stabilize it more, because essentially that plaster would protect the whole structure from the weather and from especially the timber, from the kind of hard conditions that happen up there. And in a way, our design was hidden, but that's also something that we've learned back then as young practitioners, that not everything had to be kind of brought to the very final end the way we want it or the way we think we should have it, but that there's a kind of right level of stopping. There's this kind of robust idea. So I'll switch now to a second project. Although it's multiple examples, I think I'm speaking about a singular project, and it's 3 examples in Switzerland. It's 3 competitions. We didn't win all, but I think we're going to build all. And I think this is a title that is still a working title. It's kind of called The Structures for Different Time Horizons. And it's a way that anything that locally we're practicing here, of course, a lot now, and that we're dealing with, we're looking especially through that lens. So I think if you don't know it, it was a design for a cooperative high-rise, a kind of a living tower in Bern, in which we won a prize. But it was a kind of hybrid construction, if I can use that word. It was a 3-story concrete structure, quite robust, with good maintenance. We assumed that you could actually have it for 500 years. And within very flexible spaces in between that could be appropriated, that could be changed, that could be adapted over time, that could be even treated as a plot. This kind of graph explained as well a little bit how, or explains a little bit how we understand such structures in terms of time or lifespans. So where we put the most weight, let's say, and where we are less concerned or less bothered with what will happen. This project also had a kind of interesting twist in terms of speed or building speed. We assume that with such system, also you do avoid about 30 or 40% of kind of a concrete in comparing it to a regular kind of concrete tower. But at the same time, we believe that actually there's a speed of the process that would be quite interesting in the Swiss context. And we've tested it through making it actually as a stacked model that explains the whole idea, I think, very well. And I promise we tried to cheat it with the drone, but it was also something that did not fully work in the end. So we kind of had to test it and prove it for ourselves that the prototype could be done. One of the things that we realized is the very strong Swiss regulation, and it's not something that we wanted to work against, but with. So this prototype also works in a kind of ideation way as well with the fire regulation, suggesting actually very different, let's say, units. Although it was not disputed, the time frame for that was questioned in the jury. Our system allowed, in a way, a complete adaptability over time, something that you could call capable structure almost, in a floor plan that could be easily changed or adapted in any manner. Here is it at the construction site in Bern, the everlasting one. The second structure for time horizons I'll show you is a project we recently won. We've done it in collaboration with a friend and a colleague, Guillermo Duric from Duric Architects from Zurich. It is as well a high-rise for living in Winterthur, in the Sulzerallee, and it's actually quite dear to us because we believe the project as well kind of falls back to the levels of the necessary that we're constantly seeking at. And looking at the kind of industrial side or the kind of history of the Sulzer area, we were sure, we were intrigued by the idea that we wanted to make the lightest possible tower we could. So we actually designed the tower without the classical core. And there is no concrete core that sort of stabilizes it. What you see is actually a middle zone done in a kind of steel, with prefabricated steel elements, of course sourcing from the Sulzer areal, and then, or the idea at least, and then actually that would stabilize and hold the kind of left and right body of that tower, which would be then, again, something that probably one could call a hybrid system, but we like to just see it as each material doing what it best can. You know, steel going in height, the concrete being the speed, and the wood doing kind of the most simple spans. I think on the left you will see actually as well a quick diagram on the building process that still fascinates us because we haven't built so much in Switzerland, and I think that's something now that we really get to test and prototype. On the other hand, working with our partners on landscape, inside outside, we've sort of in a very light way developed a scheme for growth across this tower, and especially across the middle zone that you have seen, that basically has this idea of an altitude as a kind of guideline, and on the other hand using the water as a tool or as a technique by just letting it fall down and sort of enrich the levels. And the middle zone is quite a special one, so it's a non-heated space. So it is a combination, altering combination of open spaces and enclosed spaces, winter gardens that could be used with various programs on the left or on the right, such as this garden. So the idea is that really that is something that would also change as you cross the heights of the tower, that you would actually understand the altitude, the wind, that you would get to see really how all kinds of habitats, which are the other sort of, let's say, the 99.9% of the residents at our environments, act and sort of really be with them without being isolated. What you've seen as well with this project is that we were still keeping this idea of complete openness and adaptability per floor, allowing the tower to be appropriated left and right according to needs over a certain lifespan of such a building. So the investigation of buildings, I'll show you the third project through this building components is as well another competition that now we're starting actually an planning phase for it to be executed. It falls back again to this idea of how much is necessary. So you can see here, this was a project done in Thalwil in Zurich, where we've tried to avoid as well, again, the story of a kind of classical core stabilizing the building, but instead we had this one repetitive element that just sort of structured the space, but both stabilized the building, offered flexibility, but also the character of the project. And it is a project that is possible to imagine in various ways. It is basically a kind of a plate that is done in concrete, upon which the kind of light construction is imagined. Of course, there's multiple versions how this could play out, but what is important to say is, again, perhaps this relationship where to kind of play on what material or what structure to carry the entire building. Here you can see the garden level with the maisonettes. I hope you see it, and sort of this cross stabilizing but also structuring the spaces, two-sided with the gallery and the kitchens orientated towards them. And this annex building for elderly, which is actually not just an addition, but in a way it's a stabilization of the entire project and the entire sort of structure. So in a way they kind of meet as good neighbors. The third project, so you can already see how our interests, sometimes they appear sort of random or occasional, but they're really guided by a certain input or a certain person that joins TEN at a certain period. For this project, we were invited to exhibit something for the Swiss Architecture Award in Basel in 2018. And we've started with the material. So I've seen the material library that you have here, and I felt immediately 5 years ago how it was for us to kind of just start by not knowing what something is. And this is about the Furan sand that is a sort of actually traditionally used as a casting sand, as a casting material. So it's actually 99-point-something% recyclable by actually always adding kind of a synthetic binder to that, which makes it ever more black. But it was used and discarded as well in kind of art fabrication as a means to an end. But for us, it was also a method on how actually one could play and explore what design could be. So we started with that material without knowing where it leads us. We knew we had a time frame. We knew we had a kind of conversation going on around the group. But there was also certain forces that just allowed us to be playful and sort of explorative without necessarily knowing where it ends. And the whole Sittewerk in St. Gallen allowed us to really feel at home and actually somehow daily fail on this material without the necessity to somehow produce immediately something beautiful that then gets to be executed. For the Swiss Art Award, we devised a kind of small plan based on the kind of classical studiolo that you all know, and that was as well something that before Discord, before even WhatsApp group of 10, we started doing by writing each other letters and emails that actually were were about a kind of a certain value or a certain idea behind this material. And you can see here Carl Rule, one of the 10 founders, actually with the first tests of that material, and actually a lot of uncertainties, a lot of fragilities, a lot of fear that it might not work, which is, I think, quite essential to designing good structures and good objects. And in a way that we started translating ever more into a kind of form that allowed us to form this space that at the same time we explored through history and theory, through contemporary culture, through references that we all knew very well. So sort of bridging the gap between drawing, writing and making. And quite dear project to us, although it never had a future afterwards, but it showed this ephemeral quality that we kind of try to achieve in each project. So that actually structure was exhibited in Basel. We ended up winning the Swiss Art Award, but it got we returned it back to the Sittewerk and it started to be used the next day for art fabrication. The fourth, let's say, slightly speculative project that we've devised as well 2-3 years ago, actually started in 2019, was something we call the distributor cooperative. And due to somehow, well, you all know this image very well, or you understand this image very well, it is as well kind of a comparison of rental prices. And you can see actually where Zurich is. So we started by looking at our own personal needs, but also at looking at the kind of global market, or looking at what happens in the city we lived in, although none of us came from Zurich and know Zurich that well. And what was the key thing was the local referendum that you all know, that basically puts in place that by 2050 the 30-something% has to be non-profit housing, which creates a lot of pressure and a lot of sort of need to suddenly build and destroy and do everything that is happening now in Zurich. And just looking a little bit more precise into the structure of the Zurich, let's say, apartments, we saw that it's not an owner city, it's a rental city. But from that, a large part is basically cooperative housing. A smaller part of that, of the non-profit housing, is the city of Zurich, which also kind of made us think on how could cooperatives be rethought. Of course, the policies don't always help. This is a famous quote, I think it was in the 1970s, 1986, sorry, Ursula Koch, head of building department. And I think it's something that you will still encounter on an everyday basis in Zurich, although the reality looks quite different. So we've used a kind of customized code to just recognize sites. And I think a term of odd lots is not something that you're not familiar with, but what we've allowed ourselves is to somehow quickly map all possible odd lots within the city of Zurich and use them on a kind of grand scale as a kind of a strategy on how a different kind of densification could happen. Reality is that these odd lots, as you know, don't really exist in the kind of official maps or official drawings. Going back to the architectural drawing as the kind of primitive technology, they're often erased from the policymakers and also very difficult to track. But applying the open information, so GIS, and developing a code with our partners, we were able to track them and actually to set up a kind of a system in which you could already see potentials for densification in your own neighborhood. This is something that is a work in progress as a project, but let's say the reality is that we all know how cooperatives are coming up with always more interesting models on how a building could be assembled out of various programs, bringing different users. Of course, the architecture plays a big role in that. What this project tried to do was to understand through these odd lots this kind of new programmatic need, or let's say a culture, on a scale of a neighborhood. So not a building, but a neighborhood. And in a way, something that would be not only for the cooperative, but a cooperative for the already residents there. So you can see a kind of a traditional model that you all know, I think, from the Kalkbreite in Zurich, and actually how that model could be played out on a specific neighborhood. And then we actually went, it was important for us, although it was a speculative project, it was important for us to create open studios and kind of workshops in which large-scale models were a testing tool to see what we could get from these spaces, to not just stay on a kind of abstract level or a coded level, but to understand how they could be a place of exhibition or a place of life or library, etc. So you can see actually here our studio in Belgrade at the time. So somehow thinking a cooperative on a scale of a neighborhood, but understanding the potential of these odd lots on a scale of a city, you quickly realize that, of course, you could stay easily within the city limits and develop and densify and reach that pressuring goal of 2050 for non-profit housing. And maybe last, not least, I'll show you a project that we've completed before, actually during the COVID. We started it before COVID times and we've completed it in COVID. And in a way, it is a project that maybe we're quite known for, but I would say that the internet got it all wrong, and that there's one truth to that, but there is another kind of truth to how we actually execute and have done that project. And here you see a sort of a layout of a WhatsApp group. So before Discord, we had a WhatsApp group with actually a client of this project. It's the Avala house in Belgrade. The Acatone magazine from Belgium actually did a really beautiful article about this house, and I want to show you a few spreads just to kind of break the myth and demystify this. This was a way to talk to the client. This was a way that we brought the client within the group, and from start to finish, that group is actually still alive, and we still sort of exchange and debate quite a lot about necessary or completely unnecessary trajectories. But the client of this house was the key element in the design. It's a local person who is actually not at all sort of famous or rich, although everybody believes he is a kind of a football star even. And you can see actually the two realities, the one that was sort of the internet reality and the reality from the site. And he approached us. He is an interior, you could say, plasterer, wall finisher, who does that for living. And he approached us with the site, with that used to be a kind of old orchard, and a kind of need to design a house for himself, starting with like absolute sufficiencies, with minimal budgets, but saying, I want to be involved in the process of making the building. I also want to maintain it if it breaks or if something needs to be repaired. And how can we do this? And he introduced one key factor I'll speak quickly about. So with him, first we made the tours around Belgrade where we looked at the culture of the self-built. And we're not only interested in the self-built, but that's also not something that we want to stay away from. And there was a kind of beautiful island close to Belgrade where it was actually an association done in the 70s where all houses had to be lifted from the ground. So the ground could belong to anyone. You don't really own the ground or touch the ground, but you have to maintain the ground. And also there was a flooding urgency, so that was a technical reason. But on the other hand, that allowed quite sort of inventive, genius ways of dealing with the soil that we've harvested from. So we started really locally. We looked at many examples with him and came to somehow a design very quickly. But the key aspect of the design, and it was not ecological at all, or it's not in a way ecological at all, but he approached us and he said, a kilometer away from the site, I have a steel workshop I want to work with, and I want to do it just with them. And that was the one input that sort of steered the whole design, this whole project. And that's him, Zocchi. He's you could say an honorary member in 10, still today. And that is the design of the house. And we've actually, before drawing any plan, we've built that model. From a sketch, we've built that model that we've refined with him and that stayed somehow a stable factor within the whole construction, because whenever we had a question, we could fall back to it. The house is a very simple design. It is a square format. It's an atrium house in a way, you could say, 16 by 16 meters with 4 interlocking terraces from which one is enclosed, or it can become an interior. And it was built around an existing garden and a few existing trees with the kind of, again, robustness towards that garden and the idea that actually we want to bring the garden completely inside to the interior. It's a house that is used for about 9 months in a year. That was also part of the brief that allowed us to explore certain, you could say, unstandard solutions, such as this one for a bathroom with the fig right next to it, actually, or a bedroom like that. And so the house is resting on 3 points. I think that was the minimum that we've devised with the engineer for the house to somehow be stable, or the square to be stable. Don't know if you can really see the ground plan, but you can understand that actually it was always about the need to somehow elevate it and free up the whole garden space. But that's the house as you know it. The other side of that project was really the sufficiency in which we operated on a daily level. And sort of that is really moving, let's say, one of these large steel frames from a workshop. And you can see already obstacles by just walking out, like driving out of this courtyard. It was a sort of a logistical nightmare, but in a way we've designed the drawing that was about to be used as a manual for a contractor to read everything he would need to know from this house. Although Zocchi was the contractor, he first tried to get several companies on board to help him with certain elements. They all refused. So he ended up really building it by himself and with us. And this drawing actually was ever useful for architects, but not for actual builders. Because in reality, this is almost how we needed to act on site. And for example, you can see the stabilization of the frame after everybody went home. So from one hand, a kind of light support and a bagger actually holding the truss. But that was a reality of the project, and it was something that we really embraced, and it took us a lot of time to understand how to deal with, because it's also, let's say, not a Swiss context, so the means were quite different. These, the key point next to the model in the project was actually casting these sort of stones, how we call them in the landscape, and that was the sort of breaking point in which no contractor wanted to involve themselves. So we used a very kind of SEC concrete, and that led us to a non-standard solution of how to do the framework. And that's where this kind of inappropriateness in the technology came in which we asked Zoran as an interior finisher to do the formwork. So once you do that, you get a kind of a formwork that is just on a kind of finesse of a finishing wall, which became really interesting in the whole process. And here you see actually one of our members in the process of casting and actually taking away the whole formwork. So the whole house, as you know it, was actually constructed with really few hands and few means. Next to Belgrade. Of course, we've engineered everything and we've foreseen everything, and we took care that there's no danger, but there was also failures and realizations throughout the process where we needed to react. So actually here you can see a very simple but a technical solution on how we actually reinforce these steel beams above the kind of concrete boulders by actually casting concrete within them. And somehow the whole garden actually, of course, grew back, and we've managed to protect certain trees around the house, and this is actually the client himself and the model we made for him before he casted one of the elements. And of course, you can imagine this space to be almost a borderless space between the outside and the inside, and used in many ways as kind of architecture of it suggests, but also he started to appropriate it in the most fantastical ways. We've seen sort of organizing parties, this is actually a birthday of his, a first birthday of his son, organizing parties in which we were always invited, we were always welcome to, and inviting friends and spending quite large periods of time at the house. But he also appropriated the house by construction, so he started to play with it almost very seriously as if it was a toy, adding a small pavilion or a winter garden for about a week to test how many people could also be there, even sort of designing with a little heating system next to it. What was fantastic is that we also learned and got ideas from this. The house today is in a kind of a second phase in which, after this 2 or 3 years, we've learned so much about it, because it's a kind of really a low technology house at the very end. Let's say the comfort of the house depends entirely on the garden, cross ventilation and the shutters. And it takes about 3 to 5 minutes to get from a scorching climate of probably like 50 degrees to something that you feel very comfortable with by opening these doors. So now we are starting to introduce other instruments and tools into the house that we think could help the future use. And to go back maybe to the Heiser quote, for us, perhaps working with simple means is enough, and it's always falling back to that idea of how much architecture really needs, and that relationship between the primordial and the technological is at the center of somehow of the dialogue and the group. And I would like to finish with this slide. So thank you all very much for the attention.
Thank you, Nemi, for this wonderful lecture and showing your amazing work. Really impressive. I hope that there are some questions. Annika, you're saving us.
I'll ask a question at the risk of maybe having missed something in the beginning, because I came a few minutes late. I'm interested in the sort of the first impulse in forming the collective of 10. If I understand correctly, that was not the idea of execution of projects. Is that right?
There was always an idea of execution of projects. We were educated as architects. Mm-hmm. There was a lot to unlearn after we graduated. Most of us graduated at ETH. And I wouldn't say that was intentional. We always wanted to build. But through the sort of the chances that appeared and the very simple means, we started to understand where maybe we have the interest to execute and where not. So I would say 10 was never focused or never formed around solely the idea to execute. Quite contrary, I would say that we all wanted that, but we all were quite ready to, and still are actually, very ready to put a lot of dynamic into the other entities. So that's one of the things that is worth also saying. Let's say no one in 10 is 100% on execution project. Everybody has to be on another entity, whether that is a research entity or the speculative entity, the ideation entity, you know, whether that is a week project or several workshops or an open kickoff studio. There's a kind of methodology that we've developed in which we can also invite others to join, and we tend to do that more and more. And now, of course, with these kind of large-scale projects, we realized that we need a stability to execute, but it became very clear that no one wanted to leave the kind of the trajectories that allow us to actually encounter or step into the conversations with others, especially the experts and people that we work with. So, and I would say, more and more we debate on how much we want to execute, and how much is enough for us as well. Of course, we are interested in it, but there has to be somehow, it becomes kind of always tougher to say, now let's do that. It's quite an interesting debate.
No, it's really interesting. I think for generations of architects, there's this phase where you establish a practice and you don't get to execute because you simply don't get the jobs yet. I remember in particular Jonathan Surgeson talking about that phase here at one of the symposia where he said we were forced to do other things, do research, publish, engage in discourse, because nobody wanted to give us projects. But of course now it is a different phase in, you know, the evolution of our discipline, I think, where we face, I don't know, new construction, memorandums, etc., where there could be a new motivation behind the question of what do we build, what do we build, when do we...
Also, you know, to that, we've realized within the group that not all are ready to commit to build of the members, and that became not a that's not a weakness in the group. That somehow became the strength recently, and I would say we were just, because we are a collective that is, as I said, physically mostly in Zurich and Belgrade. So very different, very specific to environments. We exchange a lot digitally. We're establishing a culture of physical exchange, of even if, you know, everything speaks against it at a certain time. That just to have these two worlds, like, let's say, it's always easier for us to design here by having another environment, and the other way around as well. So I would say the execution for us is more still an exploration. If I can be very sincere and sort of in a kind of beginner's role in that sense, and I think we would like to keep that, and we're like devising now ways how can this exploration remain active throughout, let's say, cost estimations, and, you know, where is this robustness that we always like to work with.
There's one question that comes up. I mean, it looks like when you're a cooperative like this, a group of people who work in a very idealistic way and have no success. And you might call it failure or even success through failure. It's one thing. Now, you know, you're having substantial work, and I mean, you're successful. It's great. It's great projects. It's big projects. How do you? I mean, with all this kind of this open system, still, you know, how do you solve the financial aspect of it? Within the authorship or non-authorship, and how can you stay once you become more and more successful and your projects might become bigger and bigger? How can you ensure that you can stay within this open kind of constellation?
Well, you're really touching into something that has been sort of alive for the past 6 to 7 months, and number one, there's a kind of open door policy and transparency. So not anything that doesn't happen on Discord didn't happen. Is not considered really. There's not a rule, or there is no sort of, you know, there's not large argumentations around this. But you're quite aware that something has to be brought into the kind of space where everybody will react. So let's say forming a new company, setting up a salary system. It's actually done in a very transparent way, in which all members, I would say, start with their own, identify their own salary, and actually influence others. And it's a dialogue. And it's not something in which we fight for a good startup capital against somebody, or, you know, and actually a shared ownership is very serious. Every member of 10 has a share in the company, let's say, that executes. So now that is another level of complexity where you can talk about the dynamic of certain people or presence of certain people, not about a sort of influence. There is several factors that create a kind of tier. There is experience, there is engagement, there is location. It's not the same if you're in Finland or in Zurich or in Belgrade. There is a kind of an average expectation of what that means throughout the certain geographies, and that is all brought into a kind of pool in which a very transparent structure is being negotiated. And what is important to say, there is no fixed solutions. Let's say you start with a prototype and you have to be ready to adapt it. And so, as I said, one of the things is that we have to kind of take care that what you call success, I would call sort of now obligations. That these obligations actually that we wanted and we meant are translated in a way where we allow still that dialogue to guide them to the thematically, architecturally, to where we want, because we are not doing this for kind of as a kind of practice of democracy. We're doing this as a kind of to practice and design architecture. And we really are quite certain there's a lot of things we couldn't coin or couldn't really confirm, but it is a kind of organic thing. It is an evolution thing, and it takes years, as I said, to set up a network. But once you set it up, networks are more robust than singular entities, because also they allow new members to immediately start shaping it. I would say that's one of the ways that we are dealing with the kind of let's say the trajectories ahead, bearing in mind these large-scale projects.
This was the sign, the sign for the bar. Let's have a drink together.
Let's have a drink. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nemi.